The conscious brain is a broom closet in the mansion of the brain with very little access to what's going on. There may be free will, but it's going to be a small player if it's there.
Every drive wants to philosophize in its spirit.
Exactly. Okay, so let's unpack that.
If you understand that aim constrains entropy, then you get some sense almost immediately why people cling so desperately to their frameworks.
This doesn't answer the free will question, though.
I thought we could walk through perception because it doesn't work the way people think it does.
When it comes to this question of truth, there is no singular truth because you've got a completely different set of experiences that have wired your brain, my brain, everyone's brain. We're all going to perceive different things and seek different things from the world.
You said something else, too, that I don't think I've thought about exactly before. Hello, everybody. I had the opportunity to speak to David Eagleman today. David is an adjunct professor of psychiatry at Stanford University. He doesn't run a lab there anymore because he runs two companies, Neosensory and BrainCheck. David recently did a course for Peterson Academy called Brain Plasticity, and in the largest sense, that's what we talked about today. Plasticity, to some degree, is an archaic term and based in an archaic metaphor, but it's been well adopted, thoroughly adopted in the neuroscience literature, and it means something like adaptive flexibility. And human beings are unique in their degree of adaptive flexibility. Now, the advantage to that is that we can change our environment and we can change our perceptions and we can adapt each generation to a radically new environment. And the price we pay for that is an intensely long period of socialization. And so we talked about brain architecture, we talked about brain chemistry, we talked about the role of aim and intent, the role that aim and intent plays in determining perception, which is a very interesting philosophical issue because what would you say? The Enlightenment view of the world, the empiricist view, was that we create our structures of reality by aggregating something like objective data. But the science of perception casts a dim light on that presumption because we prioritize our perceptions and we do that using our aim. And so we don't have perceptions that are devoid of value. And so we talked about that a lot as well. And so if you're interested in a walk through brain science from the structural perspective, the philosophical perspective, the neurochemical perspective to some degree, if you're interested in perception and emotion and motivation and drive and the competition of personalities and motivational states in the psyche, then this is the podcast for you. So you just recorded a course for Peterson Academy.
I did. Yep. So on brain plasticity, which is really my favorite topic. It's about how brains absorb the world around them and adapt to them. And the interesting part about this is that we are the only species that is as plastic as we are. So, you see a zebra get born and in 45 minutes it's running around, or a dolphin is swimming after a few minutes of being born. But if you see a Homo sapien get born, they're not doing it as quickly. And the reason is Mother Nature essentially came up with a different trick with us where she drops us into the world half-baked and we absorb the world around us, our language, our culture, we take everything that's happened before us and we springboard off the top of that. And this is the reason why Homo sapiens has taken over the planet and been so successful, because we, unlike a horse that's essentially living the same life that horses have for generations, we are living different lives every time. So that's what brain plasticity is about. And I actually don't use the word plasticity as much anymore because that was a term originally coined by William James because he was impressed by plastic manufacturing. You could mold something into shape and it would hold that shape. And he said, that's kind of what brains do. You learn the name of your fourth grade teacher and that gets written down and retained. So he called that plasticity. But what we're looking at is a system of such complexity. We've got 86 billion neurons. We've got, 200 trillion synaptic connections. And every moment of your life, this forest of neurons is reconfiguring and changing. And so I tend to call this live wiring instead of plasticity, only because I think the days of being impressed by plastic manufacturing are past us now. Where what we're looking at is a system that, every second of your life from cradle to grave is reconfiguring to represent the world around you and all of your experiences and all of your memories.
Let's talk about perception. I was reading, The Secret Incognito, The Secret Lives of the Brain, and you spend a fair bit of time in that book talking about perception. And so I thought we could walk through perception because it doesn't work the way people think it does. And the fact that it doesn't work the way people think it does has, I think, profound philosophical implications. So I want to walk through some ideas that I've been developing with you and see what you think about them. Great. So one of the things you pointed out, for example, in the book was that if you get people to look at a painting, which you might think of as a process akin to what a camera does when it takes a photograph, but you ask them different questions about the people in the photograph. So if I remember correctly, the example you used was a picture of a family in a domestic scene in a house. And you could ask them, people who are watching, who are looking at the painting, what those people were doing just before the painting image was fabricated, or you could ask them how wealthy they are, or you could ask them how old they are. And while you're doing that, you can track the movements of the viewer's eyes. And what you see is that the pattern of visual movement, so of eye movement, is similar across people depending on the question that's asked, but different in consequence of the question. So, for example, if you ask people how rich the people in the photograph are, they'll look at the clothing and the material objects in the painting. And if you ask them how old they are, they'll gaze at their faces. And a painting isn't, when you're looking at a painting, it isn't necessarily that big an object, but there's still pinpoint perceptions that have a pattern and the pattern reveals the relationship between the goal of the perception and the perception. Have I got that right?
That's exactly right. And so the key is, if you ask these people, if they did anything different while answering the question, they won't have any idea. Mm-hmm. But their eyes are like, on a covert operation doing the thing. Yeah. So as you know, of course, eyes jump around about 3 times a second. Those are called saccades. And then in between, there's little micro saccades. But the point is, we're not aware of that at all. So when your brain is going out to seek the answer to a question, it's running its mission and it's looking at all the points and pieces that it needs to gather the information. But we consciously are totally unaware of that. And this, of course, is representative of most of perception. Mm-hmm. We don't know how we're gathering the data, but this is what we do. In fact, so what my book Incognito was about, of course, was that almost everything in the brain is happening unconsciously. You just don't have any access to it and really no awareness or acquaintance with it either. And this is just a good example of that.
You used a couple of words that were interesting in that description. You talked about you said something approximating being on a mission to answer a question. And then you talked about data. And so I want to take those two things apart. So one of the sub-elements of the word question is quest, right? And a quest is a journey. And a journey is a mission. Now, there's a big difference between being on a mission and gathering data. Like the empirical view of the world, I think we'll stick with the empiricists particularly. The empiricists believe that we gathered data about the world and that we could do that in an objective manner and that we built the world out of that data gathering process. But that's not the same. It's really seriously not the same as answering a question or being on a quest, taking a journey, or being on a mission, because a mission is goal-directed. And I've been trying to work out a paradox in recent years that emerges because of the difference in those two viewpoints. Data, and you used both those metaphors in your analysis of the eye movement patterns. Data implies something directly that's value-free, but mission implies value. right?
It's definitely a mission. So,
yeah, okay.
So in this case, you're asking a question about the painting, and the subject is trying to answer that. But this is true for all of us in all cases. Let's imagine you're on a hike with friends here in Phoenix, and you guys are walking along, and one of your friends is a mycologist, so he notices the mushrooms that you don't notice, and your other friend is a climatologist, and so he's noticing the tree line and where things have changed, and you've got a friend who's a podiatrist, and she's noticing the angle of your feet, and so on. The point is that all the data is hitting all of your eyes, but you guys are seeing different things. You're having different experiences of the world predicated on what questions you're asking. And that, of course, is predicated on, who you are, all of your experiences and what is relevant to you.
And all your various aims. Yeah, well, so this is the reason I focused in on the philosophical implications of this is because the empiricists, the philosophical implication of the idea of data as reality is that reality itself is value-free and value is added to the data. But mission is a whole different way of conceptualizing things, because if the basis of data is perception and perception is mission-driven, then insofar as perception is reality, reality is not value-free. And that's at the level of perception, right? So this is why the difference is so crucial, because the empirical presumption is the data is there, you add value to it. It's like, no, the value is built into the perception, right? And there's no place in the perception where the value isn't built in. You talked about those so when your eyes move,
the saccades.
How many different levels of saccades are there? There's
the big ones about 3 times a second,
right.
And then there's the micro saccades, which are always moving. That's for a slightly different reason.
Right, but and then you can also move your eyes voluntarily.
Right.
So there's lots of patterns of eye movement.
There's smooth pursuit eye movements when you're following something.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, and then the fact that I can do this and then I can do this.
Sure.
And then also one of the things that's interesting about, you could say, the perception of perception is that we're very much inclined to watch other people's eyes. Like generally when we're conversing with people, when we're interacting with them, we see their eyes and we can see their face, although somewhat less their whole head, but at least their face, which is an emotional display system around the eyes. And the reason that we want to watch someone's eyes is because we can see what they're looking at. And the reason we want to do that is because we can infer their mission. Right.
Exactly.
We can infer their motivations, which is crucially important. Well, if you're in a defensive situation or a sexual situation or, well, any situation for that matter. And so by watching someone's eyes, you can infer their mission. But one of the corollaries of all of that on the philosophical side is that this is such a bizarre thing to understand, is that our aims structure our perceptions. Right. So so I've been separating that. I want you to tell me what you think about this. So I came up with a hypothesis when I was writing my last book, which is that a story is a description, you could say. A story is a description of the value hierarchy that structures perception. That's actually what a story is. And so part of the reason that we're so interested in stories is because, as you pointed out, when you look at the world, there's many, many ways you could look at any scene. An infinite number of ways, in fact. Yeah. So you have to navigate your way through every glance. And the structure of navigation you use determines the purpose of the perception. But it's also a strategy. And so if I know your story and I can see that you're successful, then I can adopt your mode of perception. Right? It's not your mode of adding value to the world. It's way more fundamental than that. Does that?
Yeah, tell me what you mean by adding value to the world.
Well, you could think of the world as a place of dead facts, that they're all equally perceivable. It's like, well, no, because perception's value-based. Because we've always thought, in some ways, folk psychology is perception first, right? And then it's motivation or emotion after that, let's say, and then it's cognition. And that, and sort of in a linear chain. And that turns out to be it's staggering. It's not just wrong, it's staggeringly wrong, because the values inform the perception so deeply that in many ways they determine the content of the perception, as we were talking about with regards to the painting. Hello, everybody. I want to tell you about Peterson Academy. So, as I watched the universities deteriorate and become inexcusably ideologically rigid over the years, I started thinking about what might be done to address that. We have the technology at hand now to film the best lecturers on any given topic at every university around the world, and to bring the results of that filming and distribution to a wide audience at a very low cost. And we also have the ability to do that with the best possible production quality. And so I started working with my daughter and her team on Peterson Academy a number of years ago, and we launched in August. We have about 40 courses on our platform now. We're producing for a month, and I think I can say without hesitation that they're the best courses that you can obtain on topics associated with higher education anywhere. And they're beautifully filmed and produced. There's a very inviting and welcoming social media element to Peterson Academy, and it's all available at an eminently reasonable price. We set out to produce the best education platform in the world, and I think we managed that. Go to Peterson Academy and gain access to the kind of education that was once reserved at the best institutions for the most elite and privileged of students, and change your life in consequence.
Yes. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the fascinating part is that all this is happening unconsciously. We're going and we're seeking out answers from the world, but, and it's a matter of what your attention is drawn to also. So, if I say, hey, what's the feeling of your shoe on your left foot right now?
Right.
You can become aware of that. You've got all the data, if we want to call it that, available to you, but you're only seeking little parts. And this all depends on your internal model of the world, in terms of, who you are, what is relevant to you. And that's the filter through which we interpret everything. And so, when it comes to this question of truth, there is no singular truth, because you've got a completely different set of experiences that have wired your brain, my brain, everyone's brain. We're all going to perceive different things and seek different things from the world. Something we might get into later that I'm very interested in, and I know you are too, is this collection of neural networks or personalities that we have inside. And Nietzsche's view on this was that they each have their own truth. They're each perceiving. So, we
could talk about that right away. Yeah.
Okay. So, I know you and I are both fans of Nietzsche, and
every drive wants to philosophize in its spirit.
Exactly. Okay, so let's unpack that.
Yeah.
So it's, you've got all these neural networks that have different drives and want different things. And what Nietzsche meant by that, just for the listener, of course, is, that each of those drives puts together a story or its truth about why it's seeing the world that way. So the information that you would go out into the world to seek, the mission that you run, depends on who's ascendant at that moment.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. So let's delve into that. Okay, so when psychologists first started talking about drives, who was that? I can't remember the name of the psychologist. He was an early behaviorist, but a sophisticated one. The name will come to me later. They were working at building a model of the nervous system really from the reflex up, right? And so their behavioral hypothesis was, don't explain anything using any more complex terminology if you can explain it in terms of reflex. And you can get very basic neural systems that are reflexive, that are basically spinal, and they really run in an automatic way. And so then you could imagine chains of those reflexes. You could imagine those reflexes chained together so that more and more complex behaviors could come about. And there's some truth in that. But the problem with the drive metaphor is that it's kind of like a wind-up doll, right? A drive implies, first of all, that it's motoric, that it's movement-oriented, and second, that it's algorithmic or deterministic. Now, and Nietzsche offered a more sophisticated view than that when he associated drive with philosophizing, because a mechanistic and deterministic motoric algorithm doesn't philosophize. And if you can piece this together from Nietzsche's work, and it's really clear in Jung that it's much better to conceptualize what we think of as drives as personalities. And then the huge advantage to that is that it brings in perception. Because, and you already pointed this out, at least implicitly, when we were discussing the painting. If I'm angry with you, okay, so now you could say I'm under the grip of a drive, but it's much more sophisticated and accurate to say that the personality of defensive or predatory aggression now has me in its grip. It's dominant from a neurological perspective. It's suppressing all other personalities. And so then what that's going to mean is that when you talk to me, any word that you say that I could interpret as irritating is going to be much more obvious. And anything that you say that would be peacemaking, I would regard cynically, let's say, and I would be looking in my interaction with you for pathways to victory. And it wouldn't only be that I would see that, but also if you asked me to justify my actions while we were arguing, even if I became cruel, that drive that's a personality would have all those arguments at hand too. So it's a full-fledged personality. It also has its own emotional systems, because if I'm gripped by rage, I could easily be happy to see you suffer, right? And if I'm gripped by compassion, say, well, seeing you suffer is going to put me in pain. And so I think it would be very helpful if the psychological field in general updated its model of drive, so to speak, or even motivation for that matter, to concentrate more on this personality-like model. Now, and you talked as well in the book about the diverse range of, I don't know, I think you used the word personality as well, the diverse...
I called it a team of rivals.
Yeah.
By which I mean, you've got all these, let's call them personalities under the hood. It's interesting because I think maybe I'd dial it back one step from personality. You've got different neural networks that want different things, and we can measure these. Just give an example, which is, when you're making a financial decision about what you're going to buy, you have certain networks that care about valuation. They care about the price point, and they're thinking about, okay, how much is that worth? How much is that worth? Why? So on. You have completely separate networks in the frontal lobe that care about the predicted emotional experience. Let's say you're looking at two restaurants that you're trying to choose between. So, you're making a simulation of what you think, oh, that's going to be delicious and good, and that one's not going to be so good. You've got other networks that care about the social context, as in, what do my friends think of this? Is this cool or not so cool? All these things, you've got this and more. They're all battling it out under the hood.
Yeah.
And they're all trying to steer the ship of state. And when you make a decision, it's because of the vote of the neural parliament. So what's interesting, I do want to get at this because your view of a collection of personalities where one of them is dominant, and my view of a team of rivals is slightly different in this way, which is that there's this battle going on, and you reach these sort of consensus things, just like in a parliament, where different groups will collaborate and coordinate and say, okay, look, 2 out of 3 think this, and so we're going to go for that restaurant.
Well, that would be calculated. My suspicions are is that enough of those rivals aggregate together, they can inhibit everything else.
That's exactly right.
So they'll join forces, and then their rivals will sink into silence because they've gripped They likely grip the neuropharmacological circuits that can inhibit the rivals.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Now, some of that would be calculated unconsciously, right?
Almost all of it.
But then maybe we could hash this out a little bit. So imagine it's something like this. So you're making a decision. A lot of these you make pretty quickly. And so what I would presume that would mean is that the rival systems that are doing the computations already have a behavioral pathway specified and practiced that's in keeping with their aim. So nothing new has to be instantiated. But imagine that there are situations where a novel situation arises and rivals emerge, but there isn't a clear pathway, even if one system obtains dominance. I suspect that's when you have to become conscious and you have to think. Because one of the mysteries in your book, and it's a mystery period, is given that we can compute so much unconsciously, and given how narrow the focus of consciousness is, and even how limited its ability to control, let's say, what's it good for at all? Now, we do tend to become conscious, at least in sometimes, of things that are novel. So novelty seems to have something to do with it. But so I'm curious about what you think about that.
Yeah, great. I mean, the thing is, when you look across the animal kingdom, you find these rivaling networks everywhere. So just as an example, you take a mouse, you put it in a maze, and you put cheese at the end, and you can put a little harness on the mouse and measure how much he's pulling towards the cheese.
Yeah.
Then what you can do is switch it, where instead of a piece of cheese, you have an electrical shock at the end. And you can put the harness on and measure how hard he pulls away from the electrical shock, okay? Now what you do is you put a piece of cheese and an electrical shock at the end of the thing, and the poor little mouse gets stuck halfway and turns and turns and turns at exactly the place where the two vectors cancel out, which is to say, he's running both networks. Right, you get the cheese and avoid the shock, and he gets stuck there in the middle. Right. You see this across animals.
Approach avoidance conflict.
Yeah, exactly. It's the conflict part. Okay, you take another example. The stickleback is a bird that will attack things that are red, and if you give it something, what's that?
Fish.
Oh, fish. Right. Yeah. No, wait.
Stickleback?
Stickleback gull. Wait, what's the? It's a bird.
Gull?
It's a bird. Yeah.
Okay, because there's a stickleback fish too. Okay.
Yeah. This is a bird. I think I'm 99% sure I got the name right. Stickleback gull. Okay, it'll attack things that are red. It will sit on anything that's egg-shaped. It'll sit on it. So if you put a red dot on an egg, it'll both sit on it and attack it at the same time. Okay, what these represent are rivaling networks, right? Okay, here's where I think the role of consciousness is in mediating this. And this is what we've gotten better and better at. And so when we have rivaling networks in a novel context.
Well, that would be a novel context, right? Where you have a system that's automated, another system that's automated, but the conjunction produces a paradox. Okay, so we could think of the we can think of the reason for the emergence of the cortex in that regard, because I read a series of brilliant papers on hypothalamic cats, right? So these are cats whose entire cortex is decerebrate cats. Yeah. Their entire cortex has been taken out, and most of the limbic system, and these are mostly female cats for various reasons. Female cats are more functional with only a hypothalamus, as it turns out. And if you keep them in a simple environment, like a cage, they can pretty much do what cats do. Now, they're hyper exploratory, which is pretty damn weird for an animal with almost no brain, because that's not what you'd predict.
And by the way, they can also walk on a treadmill.
Right. Well, they can mate, they can eat, they can regulate their temperature, they can defend themselves. Okay, so now imagine this. So now you have all these automated systems that you described, but they can produce conflicts, and they can produce conflicts in the moment, and they can produce conflicts across time, and they can produce social conflicts. Yeah. Okay, so now you need another part of the brain that emerges, as you said, to mediate those conflicts, and that's what the cortex does. And so that would imply that some of that lengthy socialization that you described, actually what that socialization is, at least in part, is the environment-specific means in which those conflicts that will arise in consequence of built-in motivation will be mediated. Right.
Yes.
So, right.
And now here's the thing. Rats and cats have cortex.
Yeah.
But what we have that they are not so good at is the ability to mediate well, such that we don't get stuck in the middle of the maze, but we can make a decision we can actually weigh in and say, okay, you know what? I'm not going to get stuck with these two networks. I'm going to decide on something. This is what I think consciousness is about. It's the higher level abstraction that allows you to say, okay, look, this isn't something that's automated. This is a new situation I'm in. I don't know what to do here. And then the CEO, gets called up and there's like you take a large company, the CEO can't possibly know what's happening in the company. There's 100,000 employees, right? The CEO's job fundamentally is to wait for the phone to ring and say, hey, there's trouble here. There's something going on that we don't know what to do. And the CEO makes a decision. And also, of course, to do future planning. And, consciousness is essentially about that.
Did you know that multiple companies are keeping a living profile of everything that you do online? These data brokers are making billions selling your private information to big tech companies, advertisers, and even our own government. It's concerning just how many people have given up on their privacy rights, but now you can take back control of yours by using ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN reroutes all your internet activity through encrypted servers, meaning no one can see or track what you do online. It hides your IP address so data brokers can't build a profile on you, and you can browse the internet as if you're in any of 105 different countries. Both our hosts and production teams here at the Daily Wire use ExpressVPN to reroute all their activity through secure, encrypted servers and hide their IP addresses. That means no one can track them or build profiles on their behavior. ExpressVPN is also incredibly user-friendly. One tap to connect and it works across all devices, your phone, tablet, TV, desktop, protecting up to 8 devices at the same time. Your entire family can stay protected without any hassle. And right now you can get an extra 4 months free when you use our special link. Go to expressvpn.com/Jordan and get 4 extra months of ExpressVPN. That's expressvpn.com/Jordan today.
Yes. So that's also a conflict mediation process, future planning.
Yeah.
So that the
right.
present doesn't interfere with the future.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so I think what this, what I suggested in Incognito is that maybe we can look at the way that animals resolve conflict or don't, like the poor rat that gets stuck in the middle. And we can use that as at least a rough metric for the degree of consciousness that an animal has. Because the assertion there is that, you know, consciousness allows you to mediate these things and figure out a path forward there.
Would you, okay, so a couple of things. So you could imagine a mechanism that would allow that to okay, so here's 2 potential mechanisms. So like system A has a goal and system B has a goal, and now they're locked together. Okay, so now you need a superordinate goal that's higher than both of those that can be used as a reference point to rectify the conflict, right? And you can imagine chains of those superordinate goals, right? So we get stuck in a conflict here, we're going to do this. We get stuck in a conflict here, we're going to do this, and so forth, like ad infinitum. Okay, so the cortex is going to produce those melding goals. Then that might be something like sequencing. I'm hungry and tired. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to eat now and then sleep, or I'm going to sleep now and eat. And that way the conflict between those 2 things is reconciled in a higher order frame that would take the future into account.
Yeah.
Right. And so, but then maybe the physiological mechanism is that, you know, so let's say you could turn left in the maze or you could turn right in the maze and you're spinning because you're in this conflict. The mechanism for resolution could be that the inhibitory capacity of the free cortex, so it's not bound by any given motivational state, is shifted in favor of one of the systems, right? So because focus of attention seems like that. If I'm angry, for example, and I really focus my attention, well, I could inhibit the rage or replace it with something, but I could also amplify it. Like there does seem to be voluntary attention seems to be something like the capacity to amplify it. You'd think that would be something like the turning of spare multi-purpose neural tissue to one side of a particular operation. So,
yeah, the difficulty with the consciousness question, of course, as we know, is there's no single spot in the brain that is, you know, consciousness. And so when I think about rivaling networks, I tend to think about them rivaling directly with one another. You're, of course, totally correct that, you know, for example, visual attention can amplify certain things.
Right.
It's like coming from visual cortex, you can pay auditory attention to something or something like that. But
right, so you're gathering more resources to that to that phenomenon.
Exactly. But I have to confess that we just don't know what consciousness is. Where does consciousness live in that? I mean, we can talk about visual attention, auditory attention, and so on, but where's this? It's not like an extra bit that just pays attention consciously. So that's still a bit of a mystery. It's a major mystery because nobody can figure out what the awareness element is for, right? Especially since it's so limited. Yeah. Well, what it's for, of course, is what you said at the beginning, which is the way that we go on missions into the world. You know, if I'm looking for the red object, then I find the red object. If I'm looking for the thing that looks like a broom, then I find that in the crowded space, and so on. So the visual attention is what allows us to parse the world in a way that's aligned with our mission, that what we're trying to answer in that moment.
Well, that's it. It's in the moment, right? It's got to be something like that, because you could imagine that there would be quests that are automatized so completely that the circuitry is completely there, right? But then there are new quests, so to speak, that, well, because they're new, the circuitry isn't there. Now, Goldberg pointed out when he was looking at this L. Conan Goldberg, he was Luria's student, he pointed out that when we are learning something new, much broader areas of the cortex are activated. It's much more energy demanding. And then as we learn something and automate it, this is in the typical right-handed male. So first of all, it's the patterns of cortical activation are very widespread, and there's a lot of energy that's being used probably because perceptions aren't well specified, and there's many potential pathways of action.
Exactly.
And then the activation pattern shrinks away from the right hemisphere into the left, and then it moves from the left front to the back. And as it moves, it becomes smaller and smaller area until a little machine is built, essentially, that's automated. And once that's built, well, you don't need consciousness, and it's hyper efficient.
That's exactly right. So the unconscious brain, which is most of what's happening, is all about speed and efficiency. So if you look at, for example, this study has been done with playing Tetris. So you take a bunch of people, male and female, of course, left and right-handed, and you teach them to play Tetris. So when they're first learning, they're amateurs, their brain is on fire with activity as measured functional magnetic resonance imaging. So you're measuring their brains. After they become good at it, the activity just shrinks and shrinks.
Right.
It's less and less. I did this. I competed against this 10-year-old world champion cup stacker. So he takes these cups and stacks them. It's this routine that you do as quickly as you can. I had never done it before. So we both wore high-density EEG caps, electroencephalography, and we looked at what was going on. And of course, my brain was on fire with activities. I was trying to figure out what the heck to do. But he, practicing 4 hours a day on this, his brain is essentially quiet while he does this incredibly rapid routine. So it's exactly right. The job of the brain is to take novel things and say, hey, if this is relevant and I need this, I'm going to burn it down into the circuitry so I never have to think about it again. Like bicycle riding, when you're first learning, you're paying attention to your torso and your legs and you don't know what you're doing. When you get good at it, then you can text on your phone, you can talk to someone while you're biking because it's now part of the machinery of the brain.
Right. So you could think about consciousness as something that's continually climbing up a ladder of automated processes, right? So you think and practice, and that all automates, and you become hyper efficient in your perceptions and your actions, and that disappears in some ways from consciousness. It becomes becomes part of the substructure of consciousness.
Exactly.
But then consciousness itself climbs on top of that. So it's like consciousness is like the bleeding edge of adaptation.
Oh, nice. I like that.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And what's interesting, by the way, I talked about this in the brain plasticity course and in my book, Rewires. What's interesting is that given who you are and what you've already packed down into your machinery, that determines what is relevant to you for the next thing, such that there's a million things you could learn or could pay attention to at every moment, but you're only going to take on those things that are relevant to you and push them down into the unconscious brain as a result. And we know, for example, the acetylcholinergic systems are involved in this process, which is to say, they tag relevance. They say, hey, this is something that means something to you for whatever reason, who knows, but you really care about, stamp collecting or genealogy or artwork or whatever it is that you care about. And so then you go on these missions from the world and you take stuff in and you start burning that stuff down and it means something to you. Whereas the rest of the stuff just goes.
Help me distinguish between the dopaminergic and the acetylcholinergic function. So if my understanding is that and this is part of the structuring of perception, if I posit an aim, my perception is first going to specify a pathway to that aim. So that's how the world organizes itself. And then things in the world are going to stand out for me as things that will facilitate my movement forward and things that will interfere. Everything else is irrelevant virtually. And there's a social equivalent. So people who will facilitate my movement forward are friends, and people who won't are foes, right? And so you have tools and friends and obstacles and foes. And you can also perceive things that'll transform your aim. I think those are magical things, by the way. That's that category of narrative that's magic. It transforms your aim and puts you into a new game. Okay, the dopaminergic system will tag progress towards a goal, and it'll reinforce the systems, neural systems that were active just before that progress was made to make them more dominant. Now, that's partly an indication of relevance, because what's positive towards a goal is relevant. I don't understand how that differs from the cholinergic marking of relevance. So
you've got these acetylcholinergic systems that say, hey, this is important. I want you to initiate plasticity here. And by the way, these systems, just like dopamine actually, broadcast all around the entire brain. So the dopamine system is involved in saying, hey, that was better than expected. I wasn't expecting that to happen. You get a positive burst of dopamine. If, in contrast, you're expecting a reward and you don't get it, you get
that's a punishment
in the
essentially
amount of dopamine. You have a little baseline going on.
Absence of an expected reward is technically a punishment.
Exactly right. Yep. And so that's what the dopamine system is for, saying, oh, better than expected, worse than expected. But acetylcholine is what happens when you're saying, I want to make plastic changes to the system here. Let me just give you an example. An experiment with mice, and they have to learn how to reach through a narrow slot to grab pellets and whatever. And they get better and better at it. And the parts of their brain that are involved in this task actually grow in their real estate. Okay, now you take an equivalent set of rats, you give them an acetylcholine blocker. They do exactly the same number of trials, they're doing the thing, but they don't get better and their brain doesn't change. They don't ever get better at the task. They're not faster at doing it because they don't have the plasticity available to them anymore. Because you need the acetylcholine. By the way, something that, of course, we know is all of the neuromodulators and neurotransmitter systems, these are all working together in a very complicated dance. So, dopamine is involved in saying like, hey, that was, good, bad, better or worse than expected. But acetylcholine is the thing that says, hey, let's make plasticity available here.
So it's a broader marker of relevance?
Yeah.
Is it like potential relevance? Is it something like that? And is there an emotional experience that's associated with that? If you block dopaminergic receptors, people lose positive emotion.
Yeah.
But what do they lose? What do they lose if acetylcholinergic transmission is blocked? What do they lose subjectively?
I don't know the answer to that in humans.
That's partly why I can't figure out how I can't get a handle on to understand how that system functions.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's so many acetylcholine blockers that are used in animals for things, but I don't know what the emotional experience is for a human on that. My guess, if I were just pulling something out of a hat, would be that they just feel like they don't care about this particular thing. So, for example, let's say you take
that's a major function, caring.
Oh yeah,
and that's a weird emotional condition because it doesn't exactly have a valence. It's more like, does the feeling of this matters? Could you characterize that as positive or negative? Because it could matter in a negative way, right? And it could matter in a positive way. So it seems like that would be something like the broad category of potential significance. Yeah. What happens to pupillary diameter if acetylcholine increases? Do eyes dilate?
I don't know. Good question. But just, I'm trying to think through what it would feel like. Imagine that you were trying to learn a new sport that you haven't played, pickleball, let's say. So we're both learning the sport at the same time, and for some reason it's really relevant to us. But if one of us got acetylcholine blockers, my assumption would be that we feel like, we just don't care about this thing. I'm more interested in what's going on over there or something. We wouldn't particularly care.
So it sounds like it's a broader marker of relevance. Okay, I'm going to have to look that up and see if I can specify it more particularly. Okay, so you talked about, let me just give another example of that. So when somebody gets a stroke, and let's say they get a stroke and they lose the function in their left arm's mostly paralyzed, and they can do things with their right hand. Well, so the way that you need to operate to get the left hand working again
Do you know what they do clinically so what they do is what's called constraint therapy. This is the single best move. You take the right hand, which is working well, and you pin it down, you strap it to so that they're forced to use their left hand.
Necessity.
Yeah, exactly, necessity. That's the relevance. So now I want to get the sandwich to my mouth. I have to use the left arm. I need to get my zipper down to go to the restroom. I have to use my left hand. These are the sorts of things that matter. This is what causes brain plasticity, relevance.
Okay, and if you strap down the functional hand and you used a cholinergic suppressor, would that stop the person from learning?
That's exactly it.
Right, and that seems to be, would they still try or would they just stop trying?
I don't know. I don't know what it is in humans when we use this. Yeah.
Right, because you could imagine the acetylcholine might mediate trying or intensity of effort or duration or rate, but you could also imagine that it would mediate capacity to learn if the practice was occurring.
You know what? I think it wouldn't directly be mediating the trying, because I think what would happen is you would try it, but you wouldn't have the plasticity that says, hey, something useful happened here, so let's make changes to the motor cortex over here. You just wouldn't have that. And so the system would stop trying that.
Lent is approaching, those meaningful 40 days leading up to Easter. This year, Hallow has launched an incredible prayer challenge to help you embrace the core principles of this sacred time: prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. By joining Jesus in the wilderness through fasting and sacrifice, you open yourself to tremendous spiritual growth. Experience this journey through Hallow's Lent Prayer 40 Prayer Challenge titled The Way. Following the path Jesus provides, you'll discover answers, hope, healing, truth, and beauty. Drawing from the profound writings of Saint Jose Maria Escriva, in The Way, you'll deepen your faith daily throughout Lent. The challenge features the remarkable story of Takashi Nagai, a Japanese radiologist who survived the atomic bombing of Nagasaki in 1945. Through difficulty and heartbreak, his journey led to profound spiritual transformation. This Lent, as you meditate on the lives of those who followed Christ, you'll discover that despite today's distractions and suffering, Jesus' sacrifice on the cross opens the door to his love, peace, and eternal life. Join over 1 million others in prayer this Lent. Get 3 months free covering the entire Lenten season when you visit hallow.com/Jordan. Download the app and join the Lent Prayer 40 Challenge today.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so back, we had a bit of I wouldn't call it a dispute, but a slight difference of agreement in relationship to this model of personality. And you talked about rivals. I mean, rival is a narrative-like metaphor, right? To have a rivalry is a rivalry between beings, generally speaking.
That's all we ever have, narrative metaphor.
But I think there's something worth taking apart, is because maybe you could say, well, if the rivalry is primarily played out at an unconscious level, then the metaphor of personality is not quite accurate. And so I'm just trying to think through if that's true, because if the systems are automated completely, I wonder if they're automated, I don't know if they would come replete with perceptions and thoughts exactly.
I have a suspicion that it's not, as Nietzsche said, that each, or he didn't say it, but he implied it maybe, that each one is coming with a personality or something. But my suspicion is that each one is reaching out to other spots, like visual cortex, like your limbic system, like your frontal cortex. When a network is dominant, it's sort of pulling information and sort of constructing a personality.
Well, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. So that would account for the archaic conception of possession. It's something like that, right? Well, obviously, if a drive comes to dominate your behavior, it's taken possession of your personality.
Yeah.
Like clearly.
Nice.
Okay, so then you could imagine that there's, okay, so maybe it's something like this. So maybe imagine in a motivated state that there's an automated core. And that automated core isn't going to be accompanied by a tremendous amount of consciousness. But the more additional neural system it aggregates around it, the more consciousness it accrues, right? And that would partly be because it's actually building something like a novel structure. It's got this automated core, which we would consider the drive, but then it's pulling in different elements of the totality of what's available, and that would make it more and more personality-like.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
In terms of deciding what to say next, for example, it's looking at at your whole speech system, Wernicke's and Broca's and all these areas, and saying, am I going to say something cruel or kind or whatever? But it's still using those basic mechanisms. Mm-hmm. It's taking advantage of the machinery that's there. And it just has the ability to draw on it differently than a different drive.
I've been trying to, in keeping with this model of like superordinate aims that executive function could refer to mediate conflict, I've been trying to understand if there are principles by which those superordinate aims are constructed so that they're valid. So,
what do you mean by valid?
Well, that's a good question. Not likely to produce conflict, for example. So, for example, here's an idea. So you and I, we could think of each other as a loose aggregation of potential motivated states, but we can come to an agreement. Okay, now then we could judge the quality of the agreement, I think, there's a variety of standards. We could say it's a higher quality agreement if it can sustain itself across a broader range of contexts. So if we have a friendship, which is a kind of contract or agreement, and we can get along many different places and under many different situations, then we'd think of that as a deep friendship. So it's well-constituted friendship. And then we could also imagine that if the friendship maintained itself across time, then that's another indication of its validity, right? Yeah. And then we could imagine a third dimension would be if it was stable across context and stable across time, and it improved while we implemented it, that would be a third criteria. That would be a good evaluation strategy for a good marriage. It works everywhere, it works for a long time, and as you play it out, it improves. Okay, yes. So then I've been trying to think through if there's a set of rules that obtains, like they'd be like principles of ethics that bind those kinds of agreements. So I'll give you an example. So Piaget spent a lot of time analyzing how children learned to play games with others and made friends. Okay, so the first rule of a game is something like both people have to want to play it. Okay, then the next rule is something like you get a turn in the game and then I get a turn, right? So I have to sacrifice my turn to you, but vice versa. And that's a stable arrangement. Now, and the reason we're willing to do that instead of me fighting to have the turn all the time is because it's a better game if I get to play it with you. So so then you could imagine now, if we come to a voluntary agreement about the aim, we unite our perceptions, we unite our emotions, and then we reciprocate. Okay, now if we can do that once, then we've established a precedent, and if we can repeat that, we have a friendship. Okay, but then that implies that the friendship is based, like there's rules. The aim has to be shared, the aim has to be voluntary, the participation has to be reciprocal. Now, Panksepp showed this with rats when they were playing, because Panksepp, first of all, took a kind of dominance approach to play. He showed that if you took two juvenile rats and you paired them in an arena, they'd work to play, but that the rat that was 10% bigger across rats could reliably pin the smaller rat. So then that sort of provided proof, evidence for a dominance theory of play. But then Panksepp realized that rats don't play once. They're communal. So then he paired them repeatedly, and he found that if the big rat didn't let the little rat win at least 30% of the time, the little rat wouldn't play anymore. So you could see there that there's an ethos that's emerging that's bound. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because
you're thinking about neural networks as being the rats and the kind of collaboration that neural networks work out through time.
That and across people, right?
Okay, yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out the preconditions for something like a stable social community. What works across time to mediate conflict, and then what works across people. And that's like a bounded world.
So here's what I think. I think, so you have all these different drives, some of which are very primitive, hunger and thirst and sexuality. And so you've got all these different drives, but you have more sophisticated drives too, including various forms of short-term thinking versus long-term thinking. You have these different financial drives I was talking about with valuation or predicted emotional experience or social context. You've got all these different things going on. The way that they form these agreements through time, they form these friendships, let's say, I think that makes an integrated personality. That's what makes you and me, is the way that we let these things win or lose in different circumstances. In other words, all unconsciously, these networks have worked out ways of saying, all right, look, here, I'm going to let you in here and I'm going to do this. And maybe there's an advantage to letting anger win out in this moment. I find that works sometimes. But in this other moment, I know that letting compassion win out is going to be the optimal thing for my marriage or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Okay. So there are these things. But what interests me is that no matter how integrated a personality we think we have, we're constantly in conflict. I mean, every moment of our lives, we think, oh, should I do this or that? Or we're making decisions, right? This is what decision making is about. And so there's a sense in which there's never a stable scenario where we say, okay, look, these guys have figured out how to get along. What I find interesting is ways that we can put ideas into place, like the Ulysses contract. So are you familiar with Ulysses contract? Okay. Just as you remember, Odysseus was coming home from the Trojan War and realized he was going to pass the island of the Sirens, and he wanted to hear the song of the Sirens, but he knew that like any mortal man, he'd crash into the rocks and die. So you remember what he did? He filled his men's ears with beeswax. He had them lash him to the mast, and he said, no matter what I do, just keep on sailing. Okay. What was happening here was that the Ulysses of sound mind way back here knew that the future Ulysses would behave badly when he passed the island.
Yes.
He knew that there was no way he wasn't going to behave badly there. So what he did is he made a contract with himself. He said, I'm going to lash myself to the mast so that I can't do the wrong thing. Okay, so this is what philosophers call Ulysses contract. And I'm fascinated by these because we use these in all kinds of ways in our lives. And actually, one of my next books is about this because I think it's the most practical way when you're in a moment of sober reflection to think about, okay, who do I want to be and how can I establish a Ulysses contract with myself?
Yes, definitely.
That I can't break. It's an unbreakable kind of contract.
Yeah.
And so I'll just give you an example of this.
Why were you driven?
Yeah.
Why were you attracted to the terminology contract?
Because it's not something you can break. Because it's not that Ulysses said, okay, tie me to the thing, but leave a little string here that I can pull and let the ropes down or something. It's that he was bound to that mast. He was attached to it and could not get off the mast. Okay, that's the important part. So
it's like a marriage contract.
Yeah, exactly. But even more, a marriage contract you can break also. But the key with Ulysses contracts is you really want to make them unbreakable. Here's just a couple examples. For example, in Alcoholics Anonymous, the first thing they have you do is clear all the alcohol out of your house. Because even if somebody feels like, hey, look, I'm done, I'm not going to drink, but I'll leave those things in case I have a party or whatever, they know that on some, festive Friday night or a lonely Sunday night or something, you might, okay, so you get rid of it so that the temptation can't be there. Or with drug addiction programs, first thing they tell you is, look, don't ever walk around with more than $20 in your pocket. Right. Because even if you think you're over it, at some point, someone's going to offer you drugs, and if you've got the money, you might spend it. So there's a million ways that we can make these kinds of contracts with ourselves. And the reason it's important is because what we're doing is setting up some kind of higher order ideal. Yeah. And I know you think about this in terms of religion.
I think religion is the religious enterprise is what would you say? It's the establishment and analysis and experience of those higher order contracts. I think that's a way of defining it. So you can think of the higher order the contract, the more religious-like it is. That's another way. This is a definition, by the way.
I don't know that I agree with the definition, but because let me think. Because all the Ulysses contracts that I try to always set up in my life, I don't think about them as being religious, although they are. I mean, they're.
That's why it's a matter of definition. Okay. Right. Okay. Well, so let me ask you a couple of questions based on what you just said. Okay. Because there were two ways you went, as far as I could tell, and I can't reconcile them. Okay. So we started talking about games, and you started talking about the manner in which these teams of rivals interact. And there was a suggestion there for a moment that there is something game-like about it, that so that rival systems might be integrated into a higher order agreement, which is essentially what a game is, right? I mean, when two teams are competing on a playing field, you could say they're competing, but they're also cooperating in that they're playing the same game. Yeah. Like if the game degenerates into a fist fight, a basketball game fist fight and a hockey fist fight are the same thing, right? They're not basketball or hockey, they're a fight. Right. Okay, so you can imagine a higher order agreement that has okay, so then the question would be, is the mediation between rivals best conceptualized as a game? And you pointed in that direction for a minute, but then you switched to the Ulysses contract. And so I'm wondering, like, how would you contrast a game with a contract?
I think the contract is part of the game, which is to say, gosh, I know I'm going to behave badly in that situation. So as one twist on this game, as a play in this game, I'm going to put something in place so that I can't do it.
It forbids it.
It forbids it, exactly. It's a way of saying, look, I know I've got all these rivaling networks and I'm not going to get through this. I know that right now I feel like I'm not going to drink or smoke or whatever somebody's trying to get, or die. Okay, so I've never had a drinking or smoking problem, but one thing I do try to prevent is, I'm in a restaurant and let's say it's a predefined meal and they put a dessert down. I want to have a taste of the dessert, but I don't want to eat the whole thing, okay? And what happens is, as I'm sitting there talking to everyone, I end up eating the whole thing like an idiot. So what I do is I take a bite or two, and then I take the table salt and I cover the thing in salt, the chocolate cake. So that's my Ulysses contract, because I know that the me of 3 minutes from now is going to keep sticking my fork in it. So I'm making a contract with myself that I can't break because now the cake is ruined. And so this is just one play in the game of dealing with these rivals.
It seems to me that there's a deep analogy between that Ulysses contract and something like the rule of a game. I mean, if you set up a basketball game, there are moves that are forbidden, right? And so you can think of games as enabling principles. Here's things you can do in the game, but there's rules that are forbidding as well.
Yeah.
Is it with the Ulysses contract concept that you're looking at the rules of the game that forbid? Is that the fundamental concentration on the Ulysses contract side? They're limitations rather than enabling conditions? Because you have both in a game, right?
Right.
Things you can do and things you can't do. Every game's like that.
Right.
Success in business isn't just about offering an amazing product or service, though that's certainly essential. What truly sets thriving companies apart is having powerful, reliable tools working behind the scenes to streamline every aspect of the selling process. These are the systems that turn the complex challenge of reaching customers and processing sales into something that feels effortless and natural. That's exactly where Shopify enters the picture, transforming the way businesses operate in the digital age. Nobody does selling better than Shopify. They're home to the #1 checkout on the planet. And here's the game changer. With Shop Pay, they're boosting conversions up to 50%. That means fewer abandoned carts and more sales going to your bottom line. In today's world, your business needs to be everywhere your customers are, whether that's scrolling through social media, shopping online, or walking into a physical store. Shopify powers it all, seamlessly connecting your business across the web, your store, customer feeds, and everywhere in between. And here's the truth. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Join over 2 million entrepreneurs who have already discovered the power of unified commerce with Shopify's all-in-one platform. Upgrade your business to the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/JBP, all lowercase. Head to shopify.com/JBP to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/JBP.
I guess you could think of it that way. I think of it as just another move in the game of life in a sense, which is to say, I could eat it. It's a rich energy source. It's delicious sugar, whatever. And I've got this other move I can do. I guess I think about it in terms of long-term versus short-term networks in the brain. And so how do I get those networks? Because, we can image this in fMRI. We see these areas that are involved in long and short-term thinking. So how do I get these guys to play together in the same game, but in a way that aligns with who I want to be with my long-term thinking?
Well, let's take that example because I think it provides a very concrete representation of the relationship between superordinate and subordinate goals and future and present.
Yes.
Okay, so you already outlined the reasons to eat the chocolate cake, right? It's delicious, and it's delicious because it is a source of energy and a high impact source of energy. So there's reason to eat it. And the reason is immediate, and it's tied to immediate gratification. But now so that's one game, the game of immediate gratification and energy acquisition.
Right.
But you're putting that underneath a higher order game. Okay, so one of the questions we might ask is, well, what game are you playing when you forbid yourself the cake?
Right.
What's your aim there?
That game has to do with health, has to do with, keeping slim, has to do with, all of the things, vanity, all of the things that I want to make sure the kind of person I am who doesn't gulp down the entire chocolate cake.
Right. So self-control, discipline, attractiveness, health.
Yeah.
Right. And so now one of the things we might ask ourselves, see, this is what I was trying to get at, 2 discussions ago, trying to lay out the preconditions for what constitutes a higher order game. Because one of the things we could ask is, why prioritize the constraint over the eating? Like, there's a reason for that, because you value the constraint more now. But why? Why is the health? You alluded to that. You said, well, part of it's future. There's more future, for example.
This is just part of the passage into maturity, right? We realize that it's a long game. And so we get to know that, as kids, we eat the cake every time. Maybe we get sick from it. And what we realize is that the things that we want for our lives are a different category of things.
Yeah.
And so these are part of the networks that are rivaling.
So you brought in maturity. Okay, so that's an extremely interesting move. And it seems to me to be precise and accurate, because we could think of cortical development as maturation. Yeah. We could think of socialization as maturation. Okay, so here's some principles for socialization.
Those are the same in a sense.
I take turns, right? So that means that I regulate my lower order immediate motivations communally.
Right.
Right? But then there's another axis, which is I regulate them in relationship to the future. And the more mature you are, this is a definition again, you can tell me what you think about it. The more mature you are, the better you get at regulating the immediate in relationship to the future, but also the local in relationship to the communal. So if I'm really mature, I'm going to sacrifice the present for the future and the communal. And that's better. That's a definition of better, right? So we're starting to lay out a taxonomy of value, right, in terms of conduct and in terms of perception.
I totally agree. And by the way, you introduced this idea of, thinking about the future and thinking about community, but I think we'd agree those are not orthogonal axes.
Not at all.
Exactly. They point in the same direction or similar directions.
I don't think there's any difference between your future self and a stranger. I think they're the same thing. So here's an example of that. This is so cool. I figured this out 30 years ago. Psychopaths have no compassion, but they don't learn from experience either. And so that means that not only does the psychopath have no compassion for you, he has absolutely no compassion for himself tomorrow. And then you think, oh, well, those are the same thing, right? There's no difference between those two things. Because both, why? Well, you're not feeling what your future self is feeling now any more than you're feeling what someone else is feeling now. Like a normal person a mature person, you might say, can think of their future self and they can think of the experience of that self and it matters. Just like they can think of the experience of someone else and it matters. The psychopath either can't or won't do that, right? But it's the same mechanism. You said, well, there isn't a conflict between future orientation and communal orientation. I don't think there is. I think they're the same thing.
I agree. I think they're very similar.
Yeah,
thinking about a stranger and thinking about yourself. For some reason, we have this special attachment to our future selves. So we do things like put money into an IRA. We do all kinds of things that we're doing for our future self. So our future self will be, happy, we imagine, even though our future self will be unrecognizable to us. You don't know who that future person is, and you're making all kinds of decisions in deference to them.
Yeah. Well, that's so. That begs a question, right? Which is, what are the preconditions for people to form an alliance with their future self? Yeah. And it could easily be. You tell me what you think about this. There was a psychiatrist, a very famous psychiatrist. He used to be taught personality theory all the time, and I can't even remember his name now, but one of the reasons that he was taught personality classes is because he studied the development of childhood friendships like Piaget. But one of his hypotheses was that essentially that the close friendships that children develop in early childhood, like a best friend was something like, first of all, a practice trial for a long-term marriage, but also the way that you learn to take care of your future self. So that it was through taking care of someone who wasn't you that you develop the capability of making a relationship with something that was abstract, and that would transfer to your future
that's
self.
interesting.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I would think you would need that piece.
Well, that's the question.
I'll think about that further, but here's what I would say. It's the experience of time that children have that allow them to think about time. In other words, if you and I talk about ancient Rome, we're at an age where we can kind of think about 2,000 years and think about what that means. An 8th grader learning about that in school really can't imagine 2,000 years.
No.
Much less imagine 50 years, what that time
or even
scale.
next week.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But as you mature in the world, you're able to think about time scales that you simply weren't able to before.
Right. So some of it's directly experiential.
Exactly.
You do learn that if you do X today, 2 days from now isn't so good.
Yeah.
And you can make that connection, and that wouldn't be intermediated by some other person.
Right.
So, there's no reason to assume that there aren't multiple sources of information that would mature you.
Agreed. Okay, great. So where we get then is maturation leads to an ability to think long term. It's this capacity to think about who do I want to be is something that requires experience and some amount of wisdom. And this is, I know that we share an interest in stories and how this can help us set an idea in our heads for, hey, that's who I want to be. I hadn't thought about this because my short-term networks have been having fun and I've been, in elementary school and middle school and so on. But now I'm really starting to think about this and what impact I want to make in the world. Anyway, when you have that idea in mind, even let's imagine a person is religious and really has established, hey, I want to be like this deity or, this role model of any sort. There's always conflict though, right? Because then you've got temptations in front of you, all around you. And so there's always this rivalry. I only mention this going back 10 minutes because the issue of, do these systems work out some sort of nice gameplay? Sort of, but there's also the fact that they're always in conflict. You're just always dealing with this, even when you have...
Well, that's also, maybe I would say that even if you work out a harmonious game, which is probably not a bad model for a well-integrated psyche, right? It's a well-integrated game because you're not at cross purposes to yourself, let's say. There's enough novelty that's constantly being infused that conflict's going to emerge. I mean, even imagine you have a stable marriage. Right, but a new problem emerges with a child. Well, that doesn't exactly mean that the marriage contract has been violated, but it does mean that now you have a new complex situation to deal with where you might say that not only is conflict inevitable in that situation, you might say that it's desirable because now imagine that, your child has hit puberty or something and so new problems emerge. The truth of the matter is you actually don't know how to deal with those problems. And so conflict would be useful there insofar as it's identical with diversity of opinion. And then you can imagine your wife has a temperamental take on the problem. And classically, that would be, she would be more compassionate and more upset. And you would be more judgmental and less upset. That's the classic male-female dichotomy in terms of temperament. But you can imagine that those are useful stances to begin the problem-solving process too, because it's a completely open question of whether or not the child would say needs a more stringent, future-oriented disciplinary structure, let's say, and to have that imposed, or whether they need more careful understanding so that you can understand what the problem is. There's no way of mediating that without conflict. And so the fact of the conflict also wouldn't necessarily indicate that the initial contract was faulty. It's just that you're never going to have a contract that'll deal with all possible novel situations. Hence, possibly the reason for consciousness.
That's right.
Right.
And this allows us to go back and tie two pieces together, which is that, the brain's job is really to burn things into the unconscious when it says, oh, I've got this, I've got that, this is a routine I've seen before, right? But the reason we're always conscious, the reason the brain's always burning a lot of energy is because the world throws lots of novelty at us. And so despite all our best efforts, every day is full of the unexpected, and therefore we're always in these novel conflicts.
Okay, now you said something else too that I don't think I've thought about exactly before, we're talking about the different functions of consciousness. We would never presume that there's a single function, although dancing on the edge of chaos is not a bad, comprehensive shorthand. Consciousness also seems to be the place where these visions of variant future play themselves out, right? So that's that's the theater of the mind. And so you could imagine that if a new opportunity or crisis emerged, you could envision a variety of different futures, which would be a variety of different contracts or solutions or people that you wanted to be. And you play out those in the theater of the imagination. That seems to be conscious. And it's logical that it would be consciousness if it's associated with novelty, because these new response patterns to this new emergent reality, they're not automatized. They can't be.
That's right. Although I suspect that a lot of our future simulation is unconscious, because some amount of our future sim is something that we've
It's using the machinery.
It's using the machine, exactly.
Yeah, definitely.
And so we certainly can pull things up into consciousness and think, okay, I really want to understand what it would be like if I did this and if I moved to this other city and got this other job. But much of the time, we're just slamming things forward.
Well, then you could make a rule with that, or principle for that, which is the deeper the crisis, the less automated circuitries at hand to deal with it. That's a definition of deep crisis, right? So for example, like moving houses in the same city is not as complex as moving to a house in a new city, right? And it's because more of your subroutines can be maintained if it's just moving within a neighborhood.
That's right.
Right. So, and that's that. See, Carl Friston, the neuroscientist, he's derived a pretty decent model of anxiety as an index of entropy. And so,
Cool.
Right. And so that would be anxiety as entropy, and entropy as disruption of automated subroutines.
Let me make sure I can unpack that. It's that if you're looking at a high entropy state where there's lots of possibilities, then you have higher anxiety.
Anxiety actually indexes that. That's what it's for. But then the higher the degree of possibility, the less reliable the automated systems. That's almost by definition.
And by the way, this goes back to what we were saying also about, for example, the Tetris players, or let's just say, I don't know, let's say when you play soccer as a kid, so when you first were learning how to play soccer, again, your brain, if we could have measured it while you were running around on the field, it's on fire because you're trying to figure out, wait, where's the ball? Where's everyone else? It's all knees and elbows and you don't know what's going on. Okay, a professional soccer player is 100 times better than you, but his brain isn't burning nearly as much energy as the child trying to figure this out. Mm-hmm. And so...
that's right. He's in a much lower entropy state.
Exactly. He's in a lower entropy state. Mm-hmm. And so...
That's because his movements are more efficient. And
right. But the reason is because the child is trying to simulate all the possibilities. The professional has sort of seen everything play out before.
Yeah.
That's the key. He's got the patterns, but the child has the high entropy state because, what if I try this? What if I try that?
Yeah.
And so on.
Yeah. And it's very localized too, because when the child is starting to play soccer, his field of attention is going to be like this big, right? He's going to be thinking, how many different ways can I move my foot? Right. And that makes him a pretty spectacularly horrible soccer player because he's not paying attention to anything that's going on.
Right.
In Gretzky, for example, the hockey player, one of the things he was renowned for, and you can imagine this as a consequence of layered expertise, was that he was paying attention to what was happening everywhere on the ice.
Yes.
Well, why? Well, because he didn't have to pay attention to skating. He didn't have to pay attention to how he was holding his stick. He didn't even have to pay attention to where the puck was on his stick because that was all automated. So he can move up to higher and higher levels of abstraction.
And what he famously said is, I'm not thinking about where the puck is. I'm thinking about where the puck is going to be.
Right.
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
And you do that when you learn to drive.
Yes.
Like as you get to be a better and better driver, you look farther and farther down the road.
Yeah.
Now, it's also the case, too. They've studied this with expert piano players who are playing with sheet music. They look ahead of where they're playing.
Yes.
Right. And so what they're doing in some sense, I think probably what they're doing neurologically is disinhibiting automated subsystems. And that's essentially, so I can give you an example of that. It's an example that sort of reconciles the free will deterministic conundrum. So if you do this is a ballistic movement. You wrote about these in your book, right? So if I do this, the lag time for neural transmission from here to here and back is longer than the duration of that movement. So then the question is, how do I control that movement? And the answer is, well, I've automated this routine, which is why I can stop my hand, because I can't stop it voluntarily, right? So what happens is I have the routine at hand, I disinhibit it, and it runs automated. Now, I have no free will during that ballistic movement.
Yeah.
And so what seems to happen with free will, so to speak, is that as the horizon of the future approaches, free will disappears. We devolve into automation as the present makes itself manifest.
Oh, that's very interesting. So a lot of what I've studied in my career has to do with time, our perception of time. And the bottom line, of course, is that we live slightly in the past. Why? Because it takes time for signals to get, processed and integrated, right? So when signals hit for example, I used to play baseball, and when you're swinging at a fast pitch, this all happens unconsciously. The best you can do as this ball is traveling from the mound to the plate is to adjust your swing up or down as you're already swinging. But all this is happening unconsciously. My experience has always been when I hit the ball, I become aware that I have just hit the ball. And I say to myself, throw down the bat and run.
Right.
Because it's already flying. The reason being, of course, because it takes at least half a second before you get conscious awareness of anything. The signals have to move around in your brain. As you know, signals move very slowly in the brain, about a meter per second on unmyelinated axons, maybe 10 times faster than on myelinated axons. And
it's 10 times faster.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
that's okay.
And what's interesting, we've got big bodies, right? So, if I touch your toe, the signals have to travel all the way up, up your leg and up your spinal cord to your brain. But here's the weird part. If I touch your toe and your nose at the same time, you'll feel those simultaneous.
Right.
And that's weird because how does does your brain feel the signal from the nose and then say, okay, I'm just going to wait and see if anything's coming up?
If your eyes are closed?
Yeah.
That's weird.
Yeah, so here's the thing.
Yeah, that's weird.
This, by the way, led me to a hypothesis some years ago that taller people live further in the past than shorter people because your brain has to wait for all the signals to come together. Your vision, your hearing, your touch from your toes, all this stuff to come together. It puts together your conscious perception of what's happening right now.
And then slightly longer lag time.
Slightly longer lag time if you're taller, yeah.
It's a very funny hypothesis, by the way.
Yeah. So, so we live a little bit in the past, and during that time, I totally concur. There can't be free will involved in any of the processing or certainly reflexes, but also ballistic movements that we're doing. There's no possibility for free will to operate there. If we do have free will, the argument I made at the end of Incognito is that, there may be free will. It's very difficult neuroscience-wise to nail this question of if there is or not. But if there is, it's a bit player in a much larger system. And so, you've got all this unconscious processing. Most of what's happening in the brain, I think of the conscious brain as a broom closet in the mansion of the brain. I should say the conscious mind is a broom closet in the mansion of the brain. With very little access to what's going on. There may be free will, but it's going to be a small player if it's there.
But I mean, we could reconcile what we could integrate what we discussed earlier with a free will view, because you could say, and tell me what you think about this. I mean, obviously, our choice isn't unconstrained. We're not omniscient. There's lots of things we can't do. So even if we're free will absolutists, we're still playing within a confined domain. Yeah. But can't you say, given what we discussed throughout this entire conversation, that you choose what to automate? I mean, imagine this. So you have a novel situation. You envision these variety of different futures, and there's some voluntarism in that, but then you can direct your attention towards what you determine to practice. Now,
right. This doesn't answer the free will question, though, because if I choose this particular future, we can still question whether I had free will to choose that, or if I rewound history 1,000 times, would I always choose that future?
But I guess the question then would be, if that's the case, why would it be useful to have the multiplicitous futures make themselves manifest? If there's no choice between them, why have an array?
One argument for this is that when you simulate a future, you then feel emotionally what that future feels like, and you compare that to the next future and the next future.
There's obviously truth in that.
Yeah, and maybe you need to simulate each one in order to make your evaluation. But the question is, I say, oh, that future feels the best to me. That's who I want to be in long term. But was it a free choice? I don't know. Just for the record, I don't come down one way or the other on the free will because I don't know.
Well, I think we probably have the question formulated wrong in some fundamental way, which is why it can't be resolved. But there's also likely such a constant play of indeterminacy and determinacy at every level of decision that you actually can't parse them apart, right? Because I think your argument that we lay out these different simulations and then we evaluate them, well, that's obviously what you do when you go see a movie, is like you're evaluating the decisions that different characters are making, and you're feeling that, and that is informative, and you could think about that as deterministic. But then with that argument, you have the problem, well, the reason those simulations feel the way they do was because you chose the aim that you were using to inhabit while you were doing the evaluation. And so it just flips you into the problem right away again.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And you said you were writing a new book.
Yeah.
We're running out of time on this side. So tell us, I'd like to know where your interests are going and what your new book is about.
Great. Okay, well, I'm running a couple of new books, and so one of them is called Empire of the Invisible. And this is about all the stuff that we don't see. In other words, I've always been fascinated by this question of why do each of us think we know the truth? And if we could just shout it on X in all capital letters enough, everyone would come to agree with us. Everyone would see the wisdom of our point of view.
I've seen firsthand that isn't true.
Exactly. So everybody on social media knows the truth, and on any side of the spectrum, whether you're a denizen of Wokistan or Magistan or whatever, everyone feels like it's clear. And my question is, why do we all have such limited internal models where we think we know the truth? I'm saying this in a way that's free of any political opinion. I'm speaking metapolitically now. And so this is what Empire of the Invisible is about, is how do we come to our internal models and why do we take them so seriously when we...
Well, this is why Friston's work, by the way, is so helpful. Right. Well, if you understand, at least in part, that aim constrains entropy, then you get some sense almost immediately why people cling so desperately to their frameworks, right? It isn't just that the framework lays out the pathway or specifies the perceptions.
Yeah.
It restricts entropy. And,
nice.
And then...
Let me just unpack that for the listener. It's that when you say, okay, like this is my view, I've got this, then the uncertainty is reduced. And you've got...
Yeah, to almost nothing. Well, and then there's actual physiological consequences of that, because what happens if you, especially involuntarily, enter a high entropy state, you start burning up future resources you burn up resources that could be conserved in the future, in the present. And what that actually does is age you, right? So that's an imagine a chronically elevated stress response in response to additional uncertainty.
That's right. And one of the main goals of the brain always is to reduce energy expenditure.
Of course.
Just on the immediate time scale, yeah.
Of course.
Yep.
Of course. So that's the other thing that happens too, is that, and this is, I think, the other side of the emotional landscape. So a specified and constrained aim reduces entropy. I think that's the crucial issue. But it also sets up the framework within which hope is possible, because to the degree that hope is dopaminergically mediated, right, it's a consequence. See, Friston actually had a unified theory. He told me about this when I interviewed him, because I had worked out the anxiety entropy theory with my lab in a separate paper. Okay. But he said something that I didn't know at all. Dopaminergic pleasure is also an entropy reduction phenomenon. And this is why it's so cool. So imagine that you have your aim, your goal, and now you can compute the energy required to get there. Okay, now that the farther you away from their goal, the more uncertainty there is in the pursuit. Now, if you take one step toward your goal and you do that successfully, you get a mark of positive emotion from that. That's a dopaminergic kick, but that does indicate an entropy reduction.
Yeah.
So both positive and negative emotion regulation are associated with entropy reduction.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, that's a key thing to know when you're thinking, why are people so glued to their worldviews? It's like, well, because their positive emotion is dependent on and the regulation of their negative emotion. It's like, oh, okay.
And it's a positive feedback loop, because once you have your point of view on something, then of course we know about confirmation bias and other ways where you seek data that merely validates and you ignore the data that speaks against it.
You can see that given what we talked about with regard to perception, you can see why that's the case. Once I specify an aim, what I'm going to see are things that move me towards the aim.
Exactly.
That means the contradictory information not only is irrelevant, should be irrelevant. Like, if I'm trying to walk across the room, I shouldn't be attending to every potential obstacle that could conceivably exist.
Yeah.
Right? I've already simplified things. So the obstacles aren't even there.
Right, exactly. By the way, which makes me want to come back to a point that you mentioned about socially seeing people as friends or foes. In fact, the way we see most people in the world are strangers.
Yeah.
We don't need to worry about.
Yeah, exactly. Irrelevant.
Most
things
of the
are
world.
irrelevant.
Exactly. Most things are irrelevant.
Yeah. And thank God for that.
Yeah, exactly. So that's analogous here.
So hallucinogens seem to blow that into pieces, by the way. That's what they do. Is
They cause you to pay attention. Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah. You pay attention. Everything becomes relevant.
So
that's the awe-inspiring element of the experience. But it's also very, very, very high entropy.
Yeah.
Right.
And you know what I was going to say? That this also ties back to another thing about maturation. Maturation, as who is it? I think it was Fitzgerald who said, is the ability to hold two contradictory ideas in mind at the same time. So what we're trying to do always is get our aim to reduce the entropy, our worldview. But, as we mature, we say, okay, look, it could be this. On the other hand, it could be that. And the ability to hold that and not have that, to have a slightly higher entropy and not have that be stressful to us. I don't know that I have a general model.
That's not a bad definition of a kind of a true confidence, right?
Yeah.
Right. It's also it is the model of sophisticated thinking, because one of the things you do when you think is voluntarily enter into a higher entropy state. Because to really think something through is to allow internal conflict to manifest itself. The different ideas you have are different manifestations of different aims.
Yeah.
And so when you think, this is what we're trying to train people in university. It's like, be resilient in the face of voluntarily confronted entropy, at least on the cognitive side.
That's great. And maybe instead of think, we could call it something like reconsider, because I only say this because thinking is sort of a term that might have too much semantic weight on it.
Yeah.
But reconsider, meaning, okay, I've already considered this. I know exactly how to think about it, low entropy, but now I'm going to reconsider this. I'm going to think about, what if I'm wrong about this? What if it's this totally other model? Yeah.
Well, so there's also evidence, this is very cool too. There's evidence that if you do that involuntarily, the entropy state is higher than if you do it voluntarily. And the evidence is very profound. It's very profound. And so if you take a stance of voluntary confrontation with conflict, the stress consequence is much minimized over when it happens voluntarily. That's partly why exposure works in behavior therapy. So if you have someone who's traumatized and they're involuntarily exposed to a trigger, they get worse. But if they voluntarily expose themselves, they get better, right? Even though the stimulus, so to speak, is the same.
Interesting.
And I think it has something to do with a high order meta narrative. Like, the highest order meta narrative should be something like, I can contend successfully with entropy. It's certainly with chaos. That's the sort of creature that I want to be, that I should be.
Yeah.
Right. Because then when it comes up, you don't
have
dissolve.
a reaction to it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. And I imagine this comes up a lot because people are involuntarily confronted with their political views. Often there's a whole social component to that, which is, I'm getting challenged by this person, maybe in front of other people, that sort of thing.
Definitely.
And so there's all this other stuff that comes into play. But if you get to sit in the peace of your own home and think, what if I'm wrong? What if the other party's point on this bill is...
What would that look like?
What would that look like? Yeah, that's a much calmer situation.
Yeah, well, the social element of that is also an entropy issue, as far as I can tell, because imagine that, this took me a long time to parse through. So the higher you are in a hierarchy, social hierarchy, the lower entropy your state. Your connection networks are better, your shelter's better, your security's better. Like, that's all part of being higher in a hierarchy. Okay, now the question is, what gives you the right to that position? And the answer to that is something like your accuracy in view and your competence, right? If it's a functional hierarchy.
Yep.
Okay, so now I come along and challenge you. Okay, so part of that, I'm going to cause internal distress in the manner that we described, but I'm also questioning the validity of your grip on the position in that hierarchy. So imagine a faculty meeting where you make a presentation or a professor makes a presentation and a first-year graduate student stands up and issues a successful challenge. Now, some of that's ideational, and you might say, well, maybe he's got a better theory, but some of it is a challenge to the validity of the fact that you're higher in the hierarchy than he is.
Absolutely.
Right, and that, that's played out, right?
Yes, yeah.
Right. So, So that's also an entropy issue, even the sociological element of it.
Yeah. I'm always interested in these old, the physicists in the early 20th century. Einstein was giving a presentation, and I'm afraid I forgot if I think it was Heisenberg who challenged, a young kid challenged him, and Einstein said, I think you're right. And he went home and worked on the problem for 5 days and came back. But I'm just, these stories of that kind of challenge, and Einstein had, a very mature reaction.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think a fair bit of the, what would you say, the fundamental psychological necessity of something like hero mythology is the inculcation of the attitude that you just described as characteristic of Einstein. It's like, here's a challenge. It's like, I can handle that.
Yeah.
I don't have to get defensive. It's not going to throw me off. Maybe there's opportunity. That's the dragon and the treasure, by the way. Maybe there's opportunity here in this challenge. Right? That's a very high order match. It takes very high order maturation to realize that. In every challenge, there's opportunity. Right.
Excellent.
Right. And that's something you can practice. It's an attitude that you can practice.
Yes. Excellent.
Okay. We should stop this.
Okay.
We're going to move to the Daily Wire side. What are we going to talk about on the Daily Wire side? I think we should delve more into your book. And you have some ideas.
Great.
What else should we talk about?
My brain plasticity. So we didn't talk about that at all, but I've got all kinds of cool stuff to talk about there.
Okay, so everybody who's watching, if you want to join us on the Daily Wire side for an additional half an hour, please feel free to do that. Apart from that, thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you very much for coming here to Scottsdale today. Much appreciated, and for teaching our course on the Peterson Academy, which has got a lovely trailer, which I think we're going to incorporate into this podcast, actually. And I know that the reaction to your course has been very positive so far, and so we're thrilled about that. You can catch that on Peterson Academy, by the way. Thanks for your time and attention, everybody.
Thank you.